My mom always liked to collect the teeth that fell out when I was a child. I'm not entirely sure as to why she wanted to keep them, but I didn't really think too much either. It was just something that she did. I remember that she would always claim that it was bad luck to throw away a tooth. She was a very superstitious woman, and growing up with her, some of that rubbed off on me. She kept all of my teeth inside a small wooden box with a coat of chipping red paint. Inside, red velvet lined the bottom and sides of the box, creating a soft interior for the teeth to lie on. She kept the square box inside of the top drawer of her bedside table. I only ever saw this box make an appearance when I would lose another tooth, and she would go get the box and put the tooth into it. Other than that, it stayed hidden within her drawer. I never really thought about the box and my missing teeth. I forgot it even existed until yesterday. I recently moved out of my mom's house, and so was in the process of moving all of my stuff out and into my new apartment. I entered my former home and residence of my mother, ready to pack up the final few items that still needed moving. My mom was sitting at her kitchen table, wearing long pants, a thick sweater, and woolly pink gloves. It was a strange sight to behold due to the fact that it was a warm day, but she is an eccentric woman, so I dismissed it. I greeted her, and she looked up at me and made a small, grunt-like noise that I assumed meant hello. She was sometimes a bit dismissive, especially because she wasn't too happy about me moving out. I continued on into the house, grabbing whatever was left of my stuff. I grabbed some clothes, a bottle of shampoo, and a couple of photo frames. I then remembered the old wooden box of old teeth. I didn't have any real reason for wanting to take it with me, but I guess I didn't want to risk any bad luck by not bringing it along. I wandered into my mom's room, which I know I probably shouldn't have done. I walked over to her nightstand and was just about to open it when I remembered that I should ask her permission before snooping through her things. And I called out to my mother, who was still situated in the kitchen. "Hey Mom, is it all right if I grab that box you keep my teeth in?" I yelled out. "It's in your top drawer. There's nothing I shouldn't see in there, is there?" I awaited a response from my mom. I swore I heard a slight grunting noise that vaguely sounded like a yes. So, maybe stupidly, I opened the top drawer and plucked out the small box that sat atop a pile of old photographs. I opened the box, expecting to see around 20 teeth sitting within its wooden grasp. As I lifted the lid, I immediately saw that the box was filled to the brim with teeth. Not just baby teeth, but full-sized adult teeth as well. There had to be at least 100 pearly whites all piled on top of each other. As I stared down into the box, I heard a noise behind me, like a soft grunting sound. I spun around sharply and saw my mom standing right there. She made another muffled sound, and I noticed that her mouth didn't open. Something was definitely wrong. First, she was only making noises and not talking. And second, she was collecting teeth that didn't belong to me. What's going on? Whose teeth are these? And what are you doing with them? I asked in a tone that commanded an answer. She stared at me, and her eyes provided me with some sort of answer. She was afraid. I could see it by just looking into her eyes. But was she afraid that I just discovered her horrible little secret? Or afraid because something dark and terrible was happening to her? She then opened her mouth, which gave me a much more detailed explanation. As her lips parted, I saw a normal row of teeth sitting along her gums. She then opened her mouth more, slightly tilting her head backwards as she did, and it revealed another row of teeth behind. They were jutting out of the roof of her mouth. Her entire mouth was filled with perfectly white teeth. I then noticed that the bottom of her mouth also had teeth growing out of it. Along the sides of her tongue, teeth sprouted and protruded upwards. I let out a small yelp, both surprised and scared of what I had just seen. She looked into my eyes, expecting this reaction. She then lifted both hands, grasped a gloved hand with the other, and slid her left hand mitten off. The sight of a hand absolutely covered in teeth is not one that I ever expected to witness in my life, but here it was. Covering her entire hand and onto the wrist, numerous teeth emerged from underneath the skin, poking through like sprouts growing out of dirt. Her hand was covered in the enamel growths, and no skin was visible underneath the teeth. My stomach heaved at the sight, probably both in disgust and genuine terror. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Mom took off the other glove, revealing an identical hand made up of teeth that had broken through the surface of her skin. Sensing my feeling of revulsion, I wouldn't have thought Mom would have stopped there, but she took off her woolly jumper, uncovering the rows of teeth that sat along her entire arms. Her chest area also sprouted teeth, but they were still mostly underneath the skin, like they hadn't fully grown through yet. Not like the rest of her body. I didn't need to see it, but I assumed that her legs would also be covered in teeth. I watched on in horror as I saw one of the teeth near her shoulder wobble. It wobbled only slightly, but I could tell that it was loose. She had a loose tooth on her shoulder. The wobbling continued, and I saw the tooth begin to push its way out of her skin. It gave a final wriggle before falling to the floor, completing its life cycle. I couldn't help but stand there, frozen in fear at what was occurring. I didn't know what to do. I knew I should try and help her, but shock wouldn't allow me. Not just yet. Mom then turned around and walked out of her bedroom. I stood for a moment longer before following, rather apprehensively. When I caught up to her, she was sat back down at the kitchen table, one tooth-covered arm resting on the table, the other clutched a pen. I'm not sure how she managed to hold a pen, but I knew it must have been painful to bend her fingers around it, as it would stretch the skin underneath the teeth. She must have fought through the pain because she held the pen and she brought it down to a piece of paper that was sitting on the kitchen table. She began to write. I approached the table, curious as to what was being written. I was terrified at this point and hoped that she was providing more answers as to what was happening to her. I walked up to the piece of paper and started to read. What she had written was the most terrifying thing so far. I know you are scared. I was too when I found your grandmother in this state. She looked awful, just as I do now. She didn't know what was happening to her, but luckily, death came quickly to her to stop this suffering. I never expected it to happen to me. I prayed that it never would. Yet, here I am, plagued by the same affliction as my mother. I'm sorry to tell you this, but I think it might be hereditary.
It only started a little while ago, but I fear it's getting much worse. My dad has started alternating between two faces that couldn't be more different. The first one has brown eyes just like mine, glasses that are much bigger than mine, and a beard that I won't be able to grow for at least 5 more years, as he says. When Dad wears his bearded face, we look a lot alike, although he is convinced that I'm the spitting image of my mother. I'm not sure if that's true. Mom passed away when I was still in kindergarten, and I avoid looking at old photos. In them, there are none of her and Dad's second face, and it reminds me of a time that I'm sure was much better than the one we have now. The new face is harder to describe because a regular mind has difficulties interpreting it. It almost looks like a new layer of a gray texture with dark veins was vacuum sealed on a skull. It compares to skin in some ways, it can sweat and it slightly trembles when he speaks. The sound he makes are muffled and hard to understand because there is no hole cut in for his mouth. There's none for his nose either, but I can still hear him breathing underneath. The only thing that is exposed is 2 holes cut into the upper half functioning as eyes. Luckily, I don't see the second face very often. He can change back to the old one and does so most of the time, but an image like that is hard to forget. I know this sounds entirely absurd and terrifying, but my dad is all I have, and he's not evil. Bad people did this to him. Dad used to gamble a lot and owed some people money. It's not something we talk about, but I picked it up through little clues. After Mom's death, he went through a hard time, but I swear that he has always cared about me in the ways that he knew how to. We don't have any other family, just each other. The gambling ended very abruptly. I wish I could have been happy about it, but what came after was much worse. That's when the seed for the new face was put into the soil. One evening, my dad was pacing through our apartment, mumbling things to himself. Fuck. Shit. He'll kill me. Soren will kill me. Then he looked at me, brown eyes wide open. Do you have a friend you can stay with tonight, buddy? I would have loved to do that, but my friends and even their parents were probably all asleep. No, it's too late for that, he mumbled to himself again. Go to your room, lock the door, and go to bed. I have to go out and take care of something. You're 12 now. You can do this, right? I nodded, but before I could even move, there was a knock on the door. From the look on Dad's face, I could tell these weren't visitors he was happy about. After that knock, a number of things happened. Dad rushed me to my room, which I locked from the inside. He told me to go climb in my closet, which I didn't. I sat down right next to the door. A few seconds later, our front door slammed open. I expected noise, shouting, crying maybe. But it was eerily silent. All I heard was the occasional whimper of my dad. I felt so helpless. A man spoke words in a language that I didn't understand. After that, there was only silence until finally the front door opened and closed again. For hours, I was too afraid to leave my room, but when I finally did, it was morning. I tiptoed towards the kitchen where Dad was having cereal. He smiled when he saw me, wearing his regular face. Everything seemed normal. It wasn't visible at first, but after that night, my dad had changed. At first, I only caught glimpses of it. The first time I saw it for a second in the window at night and was sure I imagined it, but then I saw it in the bathroom mirror, in his dark teacup, and sometimes in my dreams. The shape that trembles and breathes with no mouth. It was fine as long as it was only in the mirror, but as time progressed, it started growing outside the mirror. Now his face changes at least one night a week, and it stays for hours. I don't know what happened that night, only that I now spend a lot of time locked up in my room. The description of the second face, I realize, resembles a mask in many ways, but it isn't. And the reason I know that for sure is that one night when Dad was sleeping or appeared to be sleeping, I tried to take it off. I was sick of it. I hated the other face. I wanted to see my regular dad again, but it was impossible. It wouldn't move, but when he felt my hands on his new skin, his eyes opened wide and he gave me the sign. We never discussed the sign. He never speaks of it when he wears his other face. It's just something that I learned. When he pushes his fingernails into the palm of his hand, it means that I should run to my room and lock myself inside. It's the only way he's able to communicate freely when the other thing takes over. He tries to protect me, even in that unimaginable state. It usually only happens when we have odd guests in our home or before he leaves to take care of something and doesn't come back before the sun. As it only comes out at night, I can avoid it most of the time. The few times that I have witnessed it, I'd rather try and forget. He came into my room only one time. His hands were all bloody and he stained my white sheets. I kept my eyes closed and tried to ignore the muffled breath underneath his new layer of skin. I tried to hold my breath as long as I could so he wouldn't notice how scared I was. After a few minutes, I finally heard the door close again. One night, I thought he wasn't even at home. I got up to go to the bathroom. I had to go so bad I thought I'd wet myself. When I opened my door, he stood there right in front of it. No mouth, no nose, only two small cuts for eyes. He made noises as if he was trying to speak, but no real words came out. It was a terrifying sight, but he never tried to attack me, and I'd simply learned to lock my room every night and stop drinking anything before going to bed. In the morning, he'd always have his other face back and be a pretty decent dad. He really was trying. It took me a while to understand what happened and why the dangerous people even did this to him. I thought they were trying to hurt him, but now I know that they weren't punishing him. They were using him as a vassal, a body to carry the face and act on its behalf, to scare victims or do even worse things to them. I know that now because he finally opened up to me. We had dinner together, almost like a regular family sitting around our kitchen table. I can't begin to describe how out of character this is for us. We hardly ever eat together, and if we do, it's usually frozen pizza in front of the TV. Last night, however, Dad cooked. He made baked potatoes, green beans, steak, and even some really nice pepper sauce for the meat. He poured himself a glass of wine, and I had Coke in a fancy glass that I didn't even know we owned. When I had difficulties cutting my steak properly, he helped me without a word. For a few minutes, we sat there silently. I even tried to chew as slowly as possible so I wouldn't be too loud. It felt as if I was having dinner with a stranger and I had to be on my best behavior. It wasn't really a stranger though. Dad was wearing his regular face. He even smiled when he caught me staring at him. "You like this better, don't you?" he asked. When I didn't respond, he added, "This face." It felt odd because we never spoke about the obvious issue. I didn't talk to anyone about this, kept it a secret because I was afraid that someone would take away the only parent I had left. I nodded. Of course I preferred his regular face. Dad stuffed a big chunk of meat and potatoes in his mouth. "So do I. This is quite the mess we found ourselves in, isn't it, son?" Again, I only nodded. "Do you even understand it? You're pretty young, right?" "I'm not that young." He looked me up and down. "Well, you're small." He was in a mood. Normally he was only like this after a night of losing, agitated, slightly mean, but not violent. "I'm old enough to know that you've turned into a monster," I hissed. He dropped his fork and grinned. His teeth looked red from the bloody steak. "I'm not a monster, son. I only work for one. Not voluntarily, but if I stop, he brings me incredible pain. He can rip my soul into pieces simply by stating my name. At least that's what it feels like." He sighed. "And imagine if he killed me. Who'd take care of you?" I shivered at the thought of my father being murdered, and especially at hearing him talk about that, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "You and we get along well, don't we? I don't mind you being here, I really don't, but sometimes I think it'd be best if you simply left. Ran away. Disappeared." I clenched my fist so that I wouldn't start crying. "Dad, what is going on?" I whispered. He reached his left arm over the table and put his hand on top of mine. "This thing inside me, it's fighting. It wants to take control. It really is a struggle. You see, both of us want to be in charge, and switching back and forth feels numbing. If I could get rid of him, I could do so much more." "Then why don't you? Kill it. Kill the thing. We can run away. I don't care about this home. We can get help. We can go to the police." I was practically shouting. "I can't kill him. He has a mind of his own, and I'm not sure what would happen to me if I did." His eyes appeared tired and sad for a moment, but then he smiled again. I don't get," I started speaking but dropped my knife on the ground before I could form a sentence. When I reached under the table to pick it up, I saw that blood was dripping from my father's hand. I don't know how long he'd been digging his nails into his palm. This was the first time this happened, while he was wearing his regular face, which made me realize something. My dad has issues. I'm well aware of that. I'm not trying to defend him. He's messed up often in the past, but when it comes to me, he always tries to be protective. You know, if it weren't for you, I would have gotten rid of him long ago. He keeps fighting for you. It's really frustrating, you know? But I'm glad we finally got to talk. I've tried before, but it's not easy when I don't have a mouth. He didn't simply grow a new face. He became a new person." Working at the crematorium wasn't exactly the most glamorous job, but hey, it paid the bills, and that's what counted, right? Plus, I wasn't exactly miserable working there. I've never exactly been the most social guy, so at least I wasn't dealing with a lot of people. Living people, at least. And technically speaking, the work wasn't all that different from sorting files at an office job. You had to check the tags on the bodies, make sure everything was where it needed to be, place one corpse in, clean one of the machines for another corpse, collect the ashes, and make sure they're ready to go to the grieving family. Now, admittedly, it could be a little grosser than an office job at times. When a body was severely decomposed or when we had a medical cadaver who'd been taken apart, that was always messy. But I learned to get desensitized to that really quickly. I got desensitized to a lot of things. The smell of burning flesh, human ashes on my clothes, and the uncomfortable truth in the back of my mind that I'd been breathing in dead people for the past few years. Most days I was working with one or two other people. There was my manager and another guy who helped with the cremations. We usually worked alternating shifts, but every now and then we'd overlap. But every now and then I'd have days where I was working alone, and honestly, I liked those days. It used to bother me at first, being alone in a building with a bunch of dead bodies I was supposed to burn, but like everything else, in time, I grew desensitized to it. It was just another part of the job. Simple as that. I was strong enough to lift most of the bodies we got in, so I could manage on my own just fine. Up until recently, I've never had any problems. But then, there's the key word. Recently. It was one of the days when I was working alone. We had 5 bodies to burn and 3 machines. I had already put 2 of the bodies into the machines and was waiting for them to finish. It takes about 2 hours for a body to burn, and even when they do, they don't burn completely. You're left with parts of the spine, hip bones, skull, and even part of the brain. Brains don't really burn well. Anyways, I'd been prepping the 3rd machine for our 3rd customer when I heard it, something I'd never heard before. Now, bodies make sounds when they burn. They might grunt, hiss, or even moan. These are just the sounds of gases escaping the body. It's an ugly part of decomposition nobody really talks about, but I've mostly learned to tune the sounds out. Like I said before, I've grown desensitized to a lot. But here's the thing. Of all the sounds I've ever heard while cremating a body, I've never once heard one scream. I've heard urban legends about them screaming, sure, but I've never actually heard one scream. My understanding was that it was just some freaky tale that people told each other to make the prospect of death even scarier. Because, death needs to be scarier, I guess. But when I heard the screaming that day, well, I actually thought it was coming from outside. I stepped away for a bit, wondering if maybe something had happened out on the street. But as I got further away from the machines, the screaming grew fainter. It couldn't be coming from the streets. It had to be coming from one of the machines. My attention was drawn to the bodies I'd put in, and now that I was listening for it, I could hear it. The faint sound of screaming coming from inside. Truth be told, it didn't scare me. If anything, I was fascinated. I'd never heard a dead body do that before. I checked the ID I'd taken off the body I'd put inside. Phyllis Dunn, a little old lady who'd come in the day before. She'd weighed less than 100 pounds when I put her on the conveyor belt leading to the machine about 45 minutes earlier, and she'd most definitely been dead. Dunn had seemingly died of some sort of fall and had a pretty nasty gash on the side of her head. She'd been dead for a while, too. Advanced decomposition hadn't set in yet, but with the state she was in, I wouldn't have wanted anyone who loved her to see her. She looked dead. I could tell. This was weird. I would not have expected a lady like that to make that kind of sound, but all the same, I guess. I shrugged it off, figuring the screaming would stop soon. I made a mental note to ask my boss about it later. Maybe it was just air escaping from her lungs or something. Who could say for sure? I went back to my 3rd machine to finish preparing the body, hoping that maybe I could catch a short break while I waited for the other bodies to finish up. I was nearly done and just about ready to hit the button to send the last body into the machine when I heard something else I'd never heard before. The sound of someone knocking on the inside of one of the machines. I paused. Before going back to Phyllis Dunn's machine, she must have been in there for an hour at that point. Her body had to be little more than a charred skeleton. I could vaguely see the shape of a corpse through the flames, but it was hard to tell if it was moving or not. Of course it wasn't moving. Phyllis Dunn had been dead, for Christ's sake. Unless maybe it was some sort of nerve spasm, or maybe an issue with the machine itself. The banging came again. I saw sharp and sudden movement inside the machine. The screaming started up again, still muffled by the inside of the machine, but it was clearly coming from Phyllis. I took a step back, starting to feel a little uneasy now. The wall of flames made it hard to tell for sure, but I could have sworn that body moved. No, it had to just be my imagination. Dead bodies don't fucking move. And yet, the banging was still there, growing more and more frantic. The screaming seemed to grow more frantic as well, and the longer I stood there, the more I began to second guess if Phyllis Dunn had really been dead when I put her in the machine. She looked like she'd been starting to decompose. She'd had that gash in the side of her head. She looked dead. Maybe this was the wrong body in the wrong machine. Maybe it wasn't Phyllis. I looked over at the other machine. The occupant of that one was Cameron Patrick, a middle-aged man who died in a car accident. He'd also very clearly been dead. Looking into his machine, he didn't seem to be moving either. The banging from Phyllis grew louder and more aggressive, and finally, I heard it. A low, raspy voice that was muffled by the machine that was burning her. 3 words I'd never thought I'd actually hear. Let me out. The voice quaked, its tone either afraid or angry. I wasn't sure which might have scared me more. My heart was racing. She'd been burning for an hour. She couldn't still be alive. As far as I could tell, she was little more than a skeleton. She had to be dead. She had to be dead. But the voice was still there. Let me out. The tone was more commanding this time, and yet more panicked. I took a step back, my hands shaking as I tried to figure out what to do. Maybe this was a prank. It had to be a prank. My manager or the other guy who came in, they had to be playing a joke on me. Let me out. Let me out. The voice screamed. The pounding grew louder. I looked around, half hoping to see some evidence that this wasn't real, but I didn't see anything. Just an empty crematorium and the thrashing shape inside one of the machines. Let me out! Let me out! Let me out! The pounding kept growing louder, until the door to the machine shook violently. I jumped back a step. Something hit the door again, causing it to buckle. Flames erupted out the sides. Smoke started to fill the room as whatever was inside the machine struck the door again, forcing it open. Tongues of flame licked at the air outside of the machine. The searing heat washed over my face as I realized that there was no way this could be a prank. Phyllis Dunn was coming out. I could see a shadow moving through the flames. In the inferno, I could sense eyes watching me. And then I heard that impossible voice again, low and raspy, completely stripped of any humanity. My name. She knew my name. I stumbled backward, watching as a pair of charred, skeletal hands emerged from the machine. I didn't wait around to see the rest of what was attached to them. I turned and ran, tripping over myself as I sprinted towards the door. The smoke alarm had gone off. By the time I'd reached the door, the sprinklers had activated. I just kept running until I burst through the door and onto the street. And even once I saw the sun, I still kept running until my body couldn't take it anymore. By the time the firefighters were able to put out the flames, the crematorium was nothing but a charred skeleton of a building. Officially, one of the machines malfunctioned. It was nobody's fault. My boss was a little pissed at me for running the way I did, but brushed it off as me going into a panic. He's half right. If nothing else, the bodies we were burning that day got burned. They found remains they could tie to 4 of the 5 cadavers we'd had on site. The last one, Phyllis Dunn, was presumed to have been completely incinerated in the blaze. Yeah, I don't know if I believe that. I've handed in my resignation. I'm going to look for work elsewhere. If my next employer asks me about the gap on my resume, I'm going to tell them that the crematorium job just proved too much for me. It won't exactly be a lie. Just to be safe, I've also made plans to move to a new town, far away from where I used to live. Maybe Phyllis Dunn has no interest in me. After all, I'm just the guy who worked at the crematorium. Maybe whatever unfinished business she has that made her climb out of her own cremation doesn't involve me at all. It probably doesn't. And I'm going to keep telling myself that until I believe it. But until I'm sure, I'm not going to take any chances for a little while. Personally, I'm not ready to see the inside of one of those machines for myself. I used to work the night shift at the hospital. There's a reason they call it the graveyard shift. But that's another story. I don't particularly like the place, but they pay well, so I can't complain too much about being the lucky guy who gets to clean up the operating rooms after an operation. At least I had some company. His name is Joe, and he's not very outgoing. I had to ask one of the other janitors to find out his name. He likes to keep to himself, and I've never heard him talk. He's a big guy, and he has the job of mopping the hallways. He does a good job, but that's mostly because he mops so slowly and methodically that he can't possibly miss a spot. Joe is a bit of an odd bird. He wears surgical gloves and mask along with a surgical hat and gown. Maybe he's paranoid about germs. The way this hospital is run, who can blame him? Even though he's not very social, it's good to have him around, especially at night when I'm cleaning up the bloody rags and sometimes pieces of botched surgeries that litter the operating room floors. Every once in a while, Joe could be called upon to take one of the bodies down to the morgue. And yes, the morgue is the creepiest place you could possibly imagine. Trust me, you never want to go to the morgue, especially at night. One of the things I learned early on is you never look at the bodies. Your imagination will take over every time and you will see something twitch underneath a sheet. That's why I stopped looking. When I have a delivery, I do it and get the hell out. Sounds? Of course you'll hear sounds. Once again, it's probably your imagination, but every once in a great while there's a twitch or two, and then there's the person who's not quite dead, but that also is another story. You could say I've seen a lot of things during my time here. Some of the most disconcerting is the bloody handprints on the wall. I've never figured out how they get there, but as for my job, I clean it up, punch out, and go home. Do I ever mention anything to the hospital administration? Nope. I discovered long ago that there are things they just don't want to hear about. So I clean it up, keep my mouth shut, and collect my paycheck. On this particular evening, as I rolled my gurney back out of the morgue, my imagination made me think that I heard a thump, a heavy thump. However, the more sensible side of me completely ignored it and kept on pushing the gurney. At a slightly faster speed? Maybe, but nonetheless, I ignored it and went about cleaning the next OR. I became so involved in listening to my music that I never heard the doors of the room open and close again or the footsteps approaching me until it was too late. I turned around and there was a corpse lurching, arms outstretched, mouth open 3 feet from me. I froze with fear, my mind shutting down. This thing didn't seem possible. I was too stunned to defend myself. The horrid stench that emanated from it was nearly enough to finish me off. It approached, teeth bared, inches away from its macabre feast. My mind was paralyzed with fear and utter shock. And then my mind dropped further into denial when Joe burst through the door, lumbered over, grabbed the corpse, twisted its neck until I heard a sickening crunch, then threw it against the wall as if it were a rag doll. The corpse crumpled to the floor as Joe pulled off his mask to reveal a nightmare face of deathly pale skin and sunken cheeks. He seized the corpse and began chewing on its neck. He feasted on the gore of the corpse as he ripped it to pieces. The corpse twitched only twice and then ceased to struggle as Joe devoured it. A few minutes later, Joe stopped, allowed what was left of the body to fall to the floor, and looked straight at me. I'd never seen that look in his eyes before. They were inhuman, fierce, and unnaturally hungry. He advanced, arms reaching toward me. Finally, I could see Joe's face up close. His skin was pale and rotting away like a corpse. His teeth were yellow and mostly gone. As he advanced, I realized how completely helpless I was. I realized that my rescuer had become my doom, and I would soon share the same fate as the unrecognizable pile of gore that lay beside me. And then he stopped. The glaze lifted from his eyes. He looked at me, pulled his mask back over his face, and lumbered over to the body. He grabbed one leg and dragged it out of the room, leaving a trail of blood and body parts. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was a horrible nightmare. But every time I opened my eyes, the bloody splotch on the wall and the trail of blood were still there. I started mentally updating my resume, eventually finding the strength to get up and shakily walk across the room. When I stepped into the hallway, there was Joe with his back to me, slowly mopping up the trail of blood that led back to the morgue as if it was another boring night. He looked back the hall at me for one moment and then went right back to mopping. I couldn't understand why the charge nurse gave me such a strange look when I said I was going into room 14 to take a nap on my break. It wasn't unusual for us to occasionally roll the stretcher into one of the rooms to sleep for an hour or so during break on a night shift. We work 12 hours straight and just take one long break in the middle so we can actually get a decent nap in. I guess if you want to, she said, her brow furrowed. Oh, Sharon, he's new. He doesn't know about it, Jody, another nurse, said cryptically. Sharon, the charge nurse, turned and looked at her. Huh, you're right, I guess nobody's told you yet, she said, turning back to me. What? What's the deal with room 14? Now I was curious. It was the only room on the floor we had available. Everybody else was already sound asleep in their assigned sleeping cubbies. Conference rooms, storage rooms, you name it. We'd roll the stretcher in there and nap our brains out. Well, everybody who works here knows it's haunted, Sharon said. I thought she was kidding, obviously. Serious people don't believe in ghosts. People like Sharon, who was as sensible as they come, definitely didn't believe in ghosts. Seriously, I chuckled. I didn't believe in ghosts at all. I knew everything that people claimed had some rational explanation. I had seen a documentary about it once. It was fascinating how people came up with things in their minds and would remember them later and elaborate on them, making them more fantastic, adding characters like ghosts to make them seem more exciting. All a bunch of pathological liars, like the people who claim to be abducted by UFOs. Or so I thought. You guys believe that stuff? They both looked at each other, sending psychic messages back and forth. I had only been working there for a bit, so I hadn't developed that particular talent yet. Also, I didn't know the one thing all new nurses should know. Listen to the people who have been doing it longer than you. They almost always know better than you do, especially when you're really new, which I was. I mean, if you don't believe us, you can give it a shot. Guys, no! Seriously, that's not okay, the voice in the corner chimed in. Liang, a guy who had also worked there for a while. You really should not sleep in there, Jason. It's not a good place to sleep. I usually trusted Liang, so I was a bit disappointed he was joining in on this apparent prank on the newbie to the floor. Maybe they just wanted to sleep in there themselves, so they were just psyching me out, I thought. Okay guys, I get it. I'm the new guy, but seriously, I think I'll be okay. I'm really not worried. Liang tried again to convince me, but I blew him off, thinking he was taking the joke too far. Sharon and Jody had given up and were sitting there silently, waiting to see what would happen. I laughed self-consciously and went to the clean supply room to grab some blankets and brought them into the room. It was a semi-private room with 2 beds. They were both clean, so I figured I could just change the sheets when I was done and forget about rearranging the room to pull in a stretcher. This would be easier, and I was dead tired. I turned off the lights and lay down in the bed closest to the door. The room was silent and dark. I let my mind drift off to sleep. I had a terrible dream. I dreamt that someone was standing over me, watching me sleep. I knew exactly where I was and felt awake, but really, I was still asleep. I tried to lift my arms, but found they wouldn't move. I felt paralyzed and filled with dread as I tried to look up, but couldn't. I could only see a dark, vague outline of something large and malevolent. I heard the thing speaking angrily, and it began to shout, but I couldn't understand its words. My heart began to race as I realized this thing wanted me out. I tried to stand up, but found I couldn't. I began to panic and thrash about in the bed, finally, mercifully, waking up. I realized I had been asleep and had dreamt the whole thing. The whole thing had been a product of my overworked, overstressed mind. But why, then, did I still feel such panic and utter dread? It felt as if I could die at any moment. The room was silent and dark for a few more moments. Then I heard someone clear their throat next to me in the pitch-black room. I felt a chill run down my spine and goosebumps spread across my entire body. The curtain beside me had been pulled across while I was asleep, separating me from the bed next to me. I wanted to believe it was another nurse that had come in and closed the curtain so they could sleep in the other bed. But I knew that wasn't it. I could already tell something was wrong. I had to see. I pulled out my flashlight and looked beside me, terrified. Nothing at first, and then I saw a hand, gnarled and bleeding, green and black and rotten, pull back the curtain from beside me. The face that stared back at me from the second bed was not human. It was something evil, something which had gotten in here which was not supposed to be here at all. It was an abomination, a terrible, wrong thing in a place that should be meant for peace and healing. I screamed so loud I woke up the entire floor of sleeping patients. I ran from the room, falling over and bruising my hip badly in the process, getting tangled up in the laundry bin near the doorway. I fled and left the hospital entirely. I've never gone back. I can't bear to be in the same building with that thing. Now that I know it's there, I can never be in that hospital again. I could certainly never be a patient there. The patients would always tell us they had trouble sleeping in that room. I would call up the doctor and ask for some melatonin or some zopicolone, maybe a lorazepam, if it came down to it. but now I understand the real reason why no one could ever sleep in room 14.
I am a nurse at the largest hospital in my city. Although I work on several units, I am most often on the oncology and palliative care unit. For those that do not know, oncology focuses on the treatment and care of those with cancer, and palliative care is for people who are imminently dying and require symptom management interventions. With this in mind, I have been present in the final moments of many people's lives. I consider it an honor to assist others in dying with comfort and dignity, and it is very rewarding work. However, there have been several instances when the proximity of death has brought about some unexplainable events. One particular instance that comes to mind happened in my first year of the profession. This patient had already died in the evening. Their family members had left the hospital, and the body had been cleaned and dressed. It was now nighttime, around 2300 hours, and I was performing my routine paperwork while awaiting the porter to transport to the morgue. It was very quiet, and the other patients on the floor had settled for the time being. The only other noise was the hushed conversation between the other nurses and I, the clicking of various instruments in patient rooms, and the constant rumbling of the building around us. A call bell chimed at the monitor on the nursing station. I will explain now that the call bell system enables someone in a patient room to push a button on the bed, which is connected to the wall, which sends a signal to a monitor at the station. There are several buttons available, including emergent, but those are not reachable from the bed and are instead on the wall. The station monitor displays the room number and the nature of the call bell, regular or emergency, along with a designated chime based on that nature. Slow, relaxed beeps for a regular bell, rapid, intense beeping for bathroom bells, bed exit alarms, and emergency codes. A light above the door of the patient's room will become illuminated. It was not uncommon by any means to hear a call bell considering the 30-odd patients on our side of the unit. It wasn't even unusual that the call bell was coming from the recently deceased patient's room, because the porter often will press the bell to notify the nurse of their arrival. What was surprising, however, was when I entered the room, there was not a living person there, as I expected. The room remained as I had previously left it. Low lights, curtains drawn, body in a casual supine position with the wrists crossed over the waist. Had I mistaken which room had called? I peeked above the door and the light was illuminated. I thought it was strange, but sometimes these systems glitch. Alarm silenced, I returned to my desk. Approximately half an hour later, the bell was rung again. As before, I assumed it was the porter. And again, the room was unchanged with no porter present. I was a little frustrated, as I wholeheartedly believed that the call bell was malfunctioning. I even checked that the body's shoulders were not accidentally pressing the button on the inside of the side rails, but they were not. To prevent the button from being pressed, I disconnected the cord that associated the bed to the system in the wall. It sounded a cord fault alarm, which I quickly silenced in both the room and at the station monitor. The porter would just have to come to the nursing station when they arrived. Just as I was continuing my tasks, the insistent and recognizable bed exit alarm sounded. These alarms are based on weight and are usually set directly onto the bed. When weight is removed from the bed, the alarm trips to notify the nurse that a patient is getting out of bed when they should not be. Normally, these alarms, like all the others, will be displayed on the call bell monitor at the station. Alongside this, the bed itself will emit a loud alarm. At this time, there was no alarm on the monitor, but I could hear the buzzer coming from down the hall. I rushed to the sound, expecting to find a patient halfway out of bed asking for the bathroom. Instead, my heart began to sink as I realized the sound was coming from the dead patient's room. The body was perfectly still, in the same position. The alarm was loud enough to make my ears ring. Because I had not disconnected the cord from the wall, the alarm had not gone to the station monitor, but I do not remember setting the bed alarm at all. There was no need to, as the patient was deceased. Perhaps I had forgotten to turn it off? Either way, there was no reason the alarm should be sounding. The patient obviously had not moved and remained in bed. At this point, I was officially creeped out. It is in my nature to trust science above anything supernatural, and I am not a believer in souls or spirits. However, being in a room with an unanimated body is a very moving experience. Although they may not have their physical energy or liveliness, a sort of awe-striking presence can be felt. It felt as though something remained in that room, and it begged for my attention. I took several minutes of silence, just taking some deep breaths and watching the chest of the patient. There was no movement, no breathing, no signs of life remaining. I gently patted the presenting hand on the waist. It was cold and bony, and I could tell her limbs were beginning to stiffen. I left the room once more. The porter arrived about 5 minutes later, and I assisted them in placing the body on the stretcher and applying the drape. I then called a housekeeper to clean the room, and within an hour, a new patient was being admitted. The other nurses had commented on how weird those alarms were, but what truly got to me in the end was the remarks of the new room's occupant. This person was fully lucid and oriented, with no inclination towards confusion or delirium. They asked me point blank if anyone had died in their room recently. I asked why. They then proceeded to say, it was an elderly Asian woman, wasn't it? And she died of lung cancer. I didn't know how to respond to that description, as it was accurate to the body that I had previously mentioned. The patient must have read my surprise and nonchalantly said, "Very well, can you at least open the window for the poor woman?" I did as was requested and never heard about it again. I have had several other experiences that gave me goosebumps, but this is one of the most vivid I can recall.
This happened to me 2 to 3 years ago. I was around 23 at the time. I am a female and I live in Romania. One night I was coming home from class, master's. Classes start after 6 p.m. and end at 10 p.m. At around 11 p.m. I had to take the subway for about 12 stops. The destination I had to get off at was at the end of the line for the subway. At that time, there wouldn't be many people in the subway. I'm a pretty lonely person. All I need is my headset and my music, and I'm good to go. Said and done, I plug in my music. I pick the furthest chair in the subway, away from the only 2 people that were taking the subway with me at that time. So far, so good, until I see with the corner of my eye a silhouette approaching me and sitting right next to me. It was a man, fairly built, dark hair, wearing glasses, a black shirt with a black hoodie, and a sickening smile. He doesn't engage in talking with me, but would just stare at my phone as I would browse through my music. I can hear him breathe heavily, not like painfully, but still, like he was feeling something very strong. I feel uneasy, so I decide to change my seat and go even further behind, trying to avoid him without looking like a freak myself. I don't know to whom. There was just another person with us the whole way. I guess that scared me even more. I pick a new chair, sit down, plug my headset again, and proceed with the remaining 6 out of 12 stops on my way home. I see the silhouette growing bigger and bigger and a breeze running on my skin as I realize the guy is again sitting right next to me, glancing in midair, dead eyes, a big smile, staring right into my phone. I panic. There are still 4 stops to go. I have nowhere to hide. I look after the other person in the subway trying to sit next to her, thinking that strength comes in numbers. She's no longer there. I start shaking a bit, but not allowing the creeper to notice me being vulnerable. I stand up, go to the door, and just decide to stand until my stop comes. This way he won't sit next to me, right? Wrong. He comes straight after me, sits on the chair right near the door, and because he couldn't see my phone, on which he was so focused so far, from that angle, he fixates me right in my soul with his black dead eyes and says, "Hi, gorgeous. Why are you avoiding me?" I'm freaking out as I look at my phone trying to call my boyfriend or message him, and he stops me by saying, "I know no one will help you. You would have sent an SOS message by now. I know you didn't." That moment, I realize I am cornered. He has been focusing on my phone to see who I was talking to, trying to figure out if I panicked, trying to see if I would ask someone for help. He cornered me bad. I had the luck to reach my stop as I would delay any reaction or ignore him so that he would repeat whatever he wanted to say. I drop off and run for the exit, not looking back. I get out at the surface and I don't see him anymore. At this moment, I put my phone in my purse and realize I had pepper spray with me all along. My heartbeat comes back to normal as I know at least I have something to defend myself with, but still a long way to get home, and who knows if he's alone or not. I walk rather fast for maybe 5 minutes from the metro and feel a hand grabbing my wrist hard and pulling me back. Another hand covering my mouth, disabling me from screaming my lungs out. It was him. The same black hoodie, dark hair, and dead-eye stalker. He was furious and said, "Running from me? How dare you run from me? You should be honored I give you attention. I am fairly built for a woman, 80 kilograms and 1.75 m tall. So I guess he thought men don't find me beautiful or something and should feel blessed a creep like him stalks me and tries to hurt me. Now my phone is in my bag. I can't call the police. I can't reach for the pepper spray. I panic. I can't punch him in the crotch. I can't scratch him as I don't have long nails. His hand is still on my mouth. What do? I did the most desperate and disgusting thing I could think of just to save my life. I played along. I used my other hand to touch the inside of his thigh and mumble a "I'm sorry" while his hand was on my mouth. He took his hand off my mouth and I repeated that "I'm sorry." I didn't realize he was just flirting. He left his guard down and took his hand off my wrist. He asked me for my phone number and address to drop me off, but I refused, saying I'd rather add him on Facebook, and he agreed. I told him I'd reach for my phone, but instead picked the pepper spray and got him sprayed all over his face. Made sure I covered both his eyes, nose, mouth, even his ears and hands. He instantly got all red, suffocating from the pepper and swelling. I called the police, told them what had happened and what I did. They asked me if he was immobilized, and I said yes, as the effect wears off in 45 minutes. The police arrived there 5 minutes later to see me shaking like a leaf and a man on the ground, swollen like a pumpkin, throwing up and swearing me between gasps of breath. He was arrested, and the police told me they had been looking for him for the past week as they discovered the body of a 24-year-old woman in his apartment. Fairly built lady, 1.77 m tall, 75 kg, red hair. I have red hair too. The woman was his girlfriend, and ever since, he's never gotten back to the apartment. I do not know what he wanted to do with me. I can understand why he targeted me due to the similarities, but stranger in the subway stalking women at midnight, trying to befriend them, or even worse, murder them? I hope to God you and I never meet again.
This happened to me in the summer of 2015. I was dating a guy who lived in the city, and I was living at home at the time in the suburbs. Neither of us had a car, and since I lived at home with my bedroom right next to my grandma's, I always went to him. I'd take the subway to his place every week and stay for the couple of days I had off from work. To get to his apartment required taking 2 trains. One day, I was headed to see him. It was super hot out, and I was wearing a skirt with straps, a crop top, and knee-high socks. Hey, I wanted to look cute. I guess I feel this is important, as I probably stood out in this outfit, and unfortunately, I probably should have been more careful about what I was wearing, which sucks. Anyway, I'm on the first train, and after a few stops, I notice a man get on. I kind of couldn't not notice him, as he chose to stand right in front of where I was sitting and stare at me, rather than take an empty seat. It made me feel weird. The man in general gave me a very creepy vibe. He was probably in his 40s, looked unkempt, but otherwise kinda just a basic white dude whose face I can't even picture now. So, I get off at the last stop and head through the station to where I need to catch the second train, but I notice this guy is following me, which at first I figured wasn't a big deal. He could have been just going to the same place. So to get to the platform I needed to be, you have to go up some stairs, and I realize he's right behind me. I decided to turn around and go to a different platform, which happened to be packed with people, thinking if he follows me, then this is bad, but maybe I can lose him in the crowd. He follows me, and I try to duck out of view before going back to the actual platform I needed to be waiting on. I get there, and for a few minutes I feel better, until I see him again. He must have known I'd be there after I'd gone up there and then turned around. Plus it was the only other platform, and most likely he saw me the whole time. There weren't too many people waiting compared to the other side, but a few trains came that were so full I didn't bother to try and get on, and neither did he. The whole time I am texting my boyfriend, who is not taking me seriously at all. I asked he at least meet me at the station when I got to the stop by his apartment, a 5-minute walk, and he was being reluctant but agreed finally. At this point though, I'm still waiting for a train. One comes that's very full, but I'm getting restless and I want to get to a safe place. So I squeeze on, and so does the man right next to me with his arm over me. I decide that even with all these people around, I'm not safe. So right before the doors close, I hop out and the train leaves with the guy on it, staring at me as it pulled away. I waited for a few more trains to come and go, worried the guy would be waiting for me at the next stop or something. I got on a train finally, paying attention to everyone who got on at each stop. He never did, and I made it to my stop, greeted by my boyfriend who seemed put out by having to walk over. He is an ex-boyfriend and was generally kinda shitty. I'm really proud of myself for getting off that train at the last second. I don't know how much danger I was in, but I know that man was following me and definitely wasn't for any wholesome reason. And despite being in public, I feel like if he had tried anything, no one would have done shit, and I am a very small and not strong person. So, I have this coworker who was pretty much like a father to me. He used to be protective and supportive. Now that we are all in quarantine, we are all doing home office, and things started to get a little bit weird. First, I forgot to mention that he had a temporary incapacity leave due to a minor surgery, and he was on meds daily. One day, out of the blue, he sent me a WhatsApp message that said something like this: "Hey, it's 1 p.m. and I am just waking up. I'm acting like you now, lol. I had a lucid dream and you appeared there." Note number 1, he is married, has 1 kid, and he doubles my age. So, I decided to ignore it because I didn't consider it relevant. And even though I left him on scene, a couple hours later he started asking the color of the paint on my walls, and I just replied with the color and let it go. We never spoke about it again because we were discussing another topic which was more important than that: job stress. I was working 4 or 5 hours extra daily because I was doing my own tasks and also his tasks, so it was a lot to me, lol. 2 days later, we were on the phone talking about it, and he was calming me because I was starting to have a lot of anxiety attacks due to the huge amount of work I was taking on a daily basis. And just before I was about to hang up the call, he said, "Wait, I never told you about the dream I had." I was so mentally tired that I just listened to what he was saying. I'll say it in his words because I feel it's easier to tell. He said this with a happy tone. I could feel he was smiling. As I told you before, I had a lucid dream, and I was in your bedroom last night, and it felt so real. We started to make love in different positions, and it was pretty intense. And I did it like I never did it before. We started to make a lot of noises with your bed, and then your father started to knock on the door angrily asking you what was going on. But before he entered to your room, I hid under your bed, and he didn't see me, so he left. I couldn't believe what I just heard, so I just hung up the call, and I sent him a text saying that I was pretty angry and disgusted to what I just heard, and he just replied with, "I am sorry. I will say my mind to stop those thoughts." I still can't believe he said that, and I feel really disappointed because he was like a father to me now. I see all of his actions in the past just to get to this point. I have no words to explain the disgust I feel in this moment, but I needed to get it off my chest. In 2015, I, 18 at the time, met, let's just call him Ryan, 20 at the time, on OkCupid. We talked for a month or two, and then went on a few dates, and after 2 months, we had our first kiss and became official. He had moved to my state from California and told me it was because of a bad breakup with his ex of 3 years. I didn't really dig for more info, stupid, because it seemed to just upset him, and I was like, the past is in the past. We take things slow because he was a good old-fashioned kind of man, and I loved it. He opened doors for me, which is a really low bar to have, but was the first time anyone had ever done so for me, so I was smitten. He genuinely cared about my interests and my well-being, and even cooked and would bring me lunches sometimes. Fast forward to January 2016. My grandmother is in the hospital. He took off work and stayed by my side the whole time, only leaving to make food runs or runs to my parents' house for things we needed. Sadly, on the third day my grandmother passed. I stayed at his place, and he had to force me to eat because I was just so depressed I didn't want life to just go on without her. My mother recommended I move in with him so I could have the best emotional support. Eventually, after lots of care and therapy, I got better, but was still very depressed. Then disaster struck again in March when I got a call from my mother and she asked for me to put Ryan on the phone. His face got grimaced and he just said, "Okay, I understand," then handed the phone back to me. My mother then tells me that my grandfather, who had moved in with her after my grandmother's passing, had also passed away. She and my family had come home from a baseball game and had found him in the backyard. He couldn't live without my grandmother anymore. Ryan had gotten very close to my grandfather in the few months between my grandmother's passing, and my grandfather would often call him to spend time together because he wasn't used to being alone. So the death took a toll on him as well. A few months passed, and everything just felt gray. Then May came up. Ryan took me to where we had our first date, and he proposed. I thought that I had won the jackpot, and now instead of always feeling down, I had something to look forward to. But here is where things get weird. After he put a ring on it, his attitude changed. He started not liking me hanging with my friends without him. He became jealous of my male coworkers, insisting that they liked me and constantly tried to get me to quit. Just possessive in general. Things only got worse when I had a false positive pregnancy test. We were so excited to be expecting a baby. We had already had names picked out and decided to put the wedding on hold and put our focus on buying a house for our now growing family. A week or so later, I just felt off. Something told me to take another pregnancy test, which came back negative. I was understandably heartbroken, but when I told Ryan, his reaction was worse. He started crying uncontrollably, but eventually that sadness turned to anger. He started accusing me of losing the baby on purpose because I didn't love him, and then switched gears to, "You must be cheating on me," and lost the baby to hide it. Looking back, I don't know why I stayed, but at the time I figured it was just him grieving. He continued to accuse me of cheating for months. I took a shower after work. Suspicious. Must be cheating. I smiled at my phone. Must be cheating. He even went through my phone while I was asleep and deleted every guy in my phones besides him, my brother, my dad, my stepdad. Then started making me send him Snapchats with random objects with timestamps to prove to him I was where I said I was. Eventually, somehow, we got past it and decided to move in with my dad so we could buy a house faster. I picked up a second job for extra money to purely go towards our home, and Ryan decided that since I had 2 jobs, he could just quit his. With his newfound free time, he started buying cars, fixing them up, and then selling them for more money. He would also use this time to stalk my social media and question any guy who liked my post, and eventually started going through our phone bill to see numbers I was texting. He then found the breaking point. He discovered I sent more texts a month than he did, which to him was evidence that I was cheating because I have no friends. He brought this up to me one night, and I was able to talk him down and explain to him how that's about insane, even showing him that I only text him with my mom, my female best friend, and my boss, with the occasional text to my dad or uncle. We go to bed, and the next morning he goes on about it again, so I say I'm not having the same fight twice and walk out of the room. What did he decide to do? He takes my car keys and steals my car. He starts texting me about how I never loved him and that I can go ahead and report the car stolen. He doesn't care anymore, and that he might as well drive off a bridge. I finally convince him to bring it back. I get in the car and go to my mom's, and I broke it off with him. But the story doesn't end there. Oh no. He then says he only does crazy things like that because he has depression, and I ignore him if he doesn't do something crazy. He promises to get help if I give him another chance. My dumb self believed that and agreed, but only if he would go to a psychiatrist. He goes for about 3 months, gets diagnosed with bipolar depression, and is put on a treatment plan. Things start looking better, then all of a sudden they got bad again. He then told me that he had stopped going because they wanted to take away his guns, and he stopped taking his medicine and flushed it down the toilet. I broke it off with him again because he broke his promise, so then he started stalking me. Anytime I added a new male friend on Facebook, he would message them to leave me alone and that I was a cheating whore. He told me that he hopes the next guy I date beats and rapes me so I learn to appreciate him. He would show up at my work and hang around my whole shift trying to brag about insert random Tinder girl of the week here. He even figured out where my new apartment was and tried to get my roommates to let him in. He started giving out my contact info to creepy dudes saying I was easy. I eventually cut all contact after he started dating a 19-year-old girl, he was 22 by then, and bragged about just using her to pay his bills as he didn't work, and told me he had gotten her pregnant but would leave her in a heartbeat for me. After I had cut contact, I did a little research and found the real reason he left California. He stabbed his ex's brother for trying to defend her after she broke up with him. He also had several domestic abuse charges in 3 other states and had a few warrants for his arrest. I ended up feeling bad and sending the girl the screenshots of the info I had found, as well as the text he sent me about using her. She didn't believe me and said I was just his crazy jealous ex. Ugh, kids. And then blocked me. Far as I know, they now have 2 kids, and she is the only one who works. But yeah, Ryan, let's not meet. For context, my mom at the time was working 40 to 50 hours a week, so while on vacation from school, I was responsible for watching my younger sister. I was a high school junior at this time, and I had babysitting experience, so I decided, why not? I didn't get paid to watch my little sister, but she was a relatively good kid, so it wouldn't be a hassle. Before my mom went to work, she gave me the normal rules and told me to make sure I keep an eye on my little sister. I shrugged her off and sat on the couch to watch some TV. My little sister raced down the stairs 15 minutes later and asked me if she could go next door to collect some old dolls our neighbor promised her. It was a sweet old lady who was about 65 and had grandkids me and my sister's age. I told her yes, and to be back in 5 minutes, to which she put on her sandals to retrieve the dolls. At this time, my little sister had a habit of leaving the door open. I didn't mind most of the time because it was hot and we lived in a safe public neighborhood. There was slim to no crime in our neighborhood, and everyone knew everyone else. That being said, if you do something bad, your parents will know about it within the hour. Now, I know you're listening to this and thinking about how dumb it is to leave the door open, but like I said, we lived in a public place. While my sister was next door, I decided to use the restroom. We have 2 bathrooms, one half bathroom downstairs for guests and one full bathroom upstairs. While I was in the bathroom downstairs, I could hear my sister slamming the door closed and walking up the stairs to her room. I finished up, flushed, washed my hands, then sat back on the couch to watch TV. Curious to what my sister got, I called her name. No answer. Just a muffled rustling of toys. I decided to leave her alone and turn my attention back to the TV. I was so into the show I was watching, I didn't notice my little sister standing across from me. It didn't click for me that I hadn't heard her come downstairs. I just stared at her, annoyed. She kept staring at me. I paused the TV and asked her what she wanted. She looked at me wide-eyed and told me someone was upstairs. I laughed at her and told her that wasn't funny. She was still visibly scared. I thought she was joking. I asked her if she came back home a few minutes ago and she said no. She said the door was closed and pointed to the disregarded box of dolls by the back door. I walked into the kitchen and called my dad to come over and grabbed a big knife from the kitchen drawer. Walking back into the living room, I told my little sister to go into the bathroom and lock the door behind her. I told her not to open it until I told her Mom's home, so she would know it's me. I crept up the stairs and peeked into each room until I got to my little sister's door. It was cracked open, and toys and clothes now littered her normally organized room. I didn't wait. I kicked open the door and flicked on the light. My blood turned cold. In my little sister's rocking chair sat a little old woman rocking back and forth with a plastic baby doll. I stepped further into the room and demanded she get the fuck out of my house. I wasn't raised to curse at adults, but this was a strange woman in my little sister's room. She stopped rocking and started to hum the tune to a baby lullaby. The most terrifying part wasn't that she was pretending the baby was real. It was the unnatural smile stretched across her wrinkled face. She stood up and giggled on the way out and down the stairs. I stood there, staring at her room, trying to see if anything was missing. I didn't even notice that she took the doll with her. I walked back downstairs and checked the room before letting my little sister know she can come out after I locked the doors. By then, my dad was pulling up in the driveway up front, and I told him what had just happened. He walked around and checked the rooms like I had. While he was upstairs, my little sister told me the old lady knew where she had been and tried to get her to come with her. The creepiest part was my sister told me she sounded like she was attempting to sound like me, but when she didn't say Mom's home, she stepped away from the door. I don't know who that was that walked into my house to steal my little sister's doll, but let's not meet.